Viewers came away from the Season 2 finale of White Lotus with a lot of unanswered questions. Questions like, what exactly happened between Cameron and Harper when they went up to the room together? Did Ethan and Daphne hook up on the Isola Bella? And was Quentin really plotting with Greg to kill Tanya? A lot of internet ink has already been spilled trying to follow back trails of breadcrumbs to figure out the answers to these questions, and none of them are anything close to decisive. So instead of rushing into that cul-de-sac of baseless speculation, I'd like to propose a different way of confronting these unknowns. Maybe they're meant to be left as unsolved mysteries, and maybe the fact that we as the audience are so inclined to grasp at little straws of symbolism and innuendo says a lot more about us and the way that we interact with narratives than it says about the characters in White Lotus and what happens to them. So in today's video, I'm going to break down some storylines from White Lotus to illustrate the gap between what we think we know and what we actually know. I'll then talk about why I think the show's creators chose to tell the stories of Season 2 in this way, as well as the message their method conveys. Finally, I'll show that this storytelling technique isn't really all that unique. It abounds in present-day popular narratives. But first, some light, and I mean very light, don't worry, literary theory. In 2004, Kurt Vonnegut gave a lecture at Case Western Reserve University, which was video recorded and can be found on YouTube.
You know what a twerp was when I was in high school in Indianapolis a long time ago? It was a guy who stuffed false teeth up his rear end and bit the buttons off the back seats of taxi cabs.
In one section of the lecture, Vonnegut illustrates a handful of story archetypes by mapping them onto a two-dimensional plane where the horizontal axis represents time and the vertical axis represents the main character's good or ill fortune. One story archetype, for example, is called Man in a Hole.
But it needn't be about a man in a hole. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again.
Another of these diagrams, in which a character's situation starts out pretty miserable, then improves bit by bit, then gets miserable again, and then shoots back up to infinite joy and good fortune, maps onto Cinderella and other stories based on it. But then Vonnegut does his Vonnegut thing and busts through the whimsy with a profound point. The good fortune-ill fortune axis is a lie. Life is ambiguous, and we often don't know enough to judge events as good or bad.
This rise and fall is in fact artificial. It's pretense that we know more about life than we really do.
It follows that literature that purports to tell the truth should not be capable of being diagrammed like this.
A true masterpiece cannot be crucified on a cross of this design.
Vonnegut's example of such a masterpiece is Hamlet, a play that, as Vonnegut recounts it, depicts a series of events that are neither clearly good nor obviously bad for the protagonist.
It's neither good nor bad news, just something that happened.
Vonnegut's suggestion, then, is that whether in books, movies, TV, or real life, whenever we experience narrative tension or resolution related to a character's good or bad fortune, that's only because we pretend to know what the good news is and what the bad news is. Without thinking about it, we force a misshapen chaos of formless events into meta-narrative molds like the archetypes that Vonnegut describes in his lecture. These meta-narratives guide our interpretation of stories as much as the actual events of the stories themselves do. White Lotus goes a step further than Vonnegut's archetypes. In White Lotus, meta-narratives do not only guide the audience's interpretation about whether events are good or bad for the characters, they also lure the audience towards certain dubious conclusions about what actually happened in the first place. The portion of White Lotus that centers around Harper, Ethan, Daphne, and Cameron is full of plot holes. Not plot holes in the sense of events that are illogical or impossible to believe, but rather plot holes in a much more basic sense. Holes in the plot, sections of the story that take place off screen so that the audience doesn't know what happens. The two most notable of these plot holes involve cases of possible infidelity. After Harper confronts Ethan about an empty condom wrapper she found, Ethan admits that he and Cameron partied with Lucia and Mia. Harper is pissed and Ethan is pissed that she's pissed. They head to the beach, where Harper stokes Ethan's anger and insecurity by joining Cameron for drinks at the beachside bar, while Ethan goes for a butthurt swim in the ocean. When Ethan comes back to shore, Cameron and Harper are missing, and Ethan has a 15-minute-old text from Harper telling him that she's going up to the room to get her hat. Ethan storms up to the room to find Harper inside with the main door bolted and the adjoining door leading to Cameron and Daphne's room ajar. What happened? Well, after a lengthy interrogation, Harper says that Cameron had been coming on to her the previous night, and that she and Cameron kissed when they came up to the room, but there's no way to know whether there was more or less to it than that. Ethan confronts Cameron and a sexy ocean choke fight commences. He then runs into Daphne, who he vents to about his suspicions regarding Harper and Cameron. Daphne then delivers the most important lines in the show, both because they sum up a major theme of the series, and because they inspired me to make this video essay masterpiece.
I don't think you have anything to worry about. I mean, we never really know what goes on in people's minds or what they do, right? A little mystery. It's kind of sexy.
Here, I think Daphne is not just speaking for herself, but for all of White Lotus Season 2. Don't try too hard to figure out what's really going on, because you can never know anyway. And besides, aren't things a whole lot more fun with a bit of mystery sprinkled in? Right after this, Daphne invites Ethan to join her on the Isola Bella, and the two head off to the secluded island with Ethan pondering Daphne's advice and Daphne looking back at him alluringly. And then well, we don't know. It's a mystery. Isn't that fun? Well, I'll tell you who doesn't think it's much fun. A lot of people on the internet. Many are convinced, based on the scant evidence we're given, that first Harper and Cameron, and then Ethan and Daphne totally went all the way. Why are viewers so certain that these characters full-blown cheated on their spouses? One big reason why is because their story is backgrounded by a meta-narrative of cheating and revenge, the myth of the Testa d'Amoro. On their first day at the White Lotus Resort, Ethan notices that the hotel is decorated with elaborate flower pots in the shape of a man's head, including one in his and Harper's room.
Hey, what is with these head things? We keep seeing them everywhere.
Testa d'Amoro.
Testa d'Amoro?
Yeah. Well, the story is, a Moor came here a long time ago and seduced a local girl. But then she found out that he had a wife and children back home. So because he lied to her, she cut his head off.
Oh,
Jesus.
So if you put one of those outside of your house, what are you saying?
If you come into my house, don't fuck my wife.
The Testa d'Amoro sculptures maintain a recurring presence in scenes featuring Ethan, Harper, Daphne, and Cameron, a clear suggestion that deceit and infidelity are crucial parts of their story. So even though Cameron is the only one directly depicted cheating, the suggestiveness of the Testa d'Amoro is enough to convince viewers that Ethan, Harper, and Daphne are secret cheaters as well. This method of cementing together fact bricks with meta-narrative mortar isn't limited to these four, though. It also shows up in Tanya's tragic story and in Albie and Dominic's plot as well.
These gays, they're trying to murder me.
As with the alleged cheating among Harper, Cameron, Ethan, and Daphne, viewers are convinced that Quentin and his friends were plotting with Tanya's AWOL husband Greg to kill Tanya and take her wealth. This despite the fact that we never see direct evidence that Quentin is plotting anything, nor that he even knows Greg. There's just an old photo of a guy that Tanya thinks looks a lot like Greg. Tanya is so convinced that Quentin is up to no good that it ends up leading to her tragicomic demise. She grabs Nicolo's bag, in which she finds a gun, and then unloads on Quentin and all of his friends. Well, not this guy, he got away when she ran out of bullets. And not the captain, who we can hear running around the upper deck.
You're gay?
Tanya then tries to jump down into the speedboat and doinks her head on the railing. And scene. Why was Tanya so convinced of Quentin's plot, and why was the audience so convinced along with her? There's little evidence to go on. We see some whispering one morning at breakfast, and there's Jack's mention to Portia that Quentin has no money but is about to come into a bunch of it. And then of course there's that photo that maybe could be Greg.
It looks just like Greg.
And that's about it. Well, there's also the fact that Jack is almost certainly not Quentin's nephew because their accents index different regions and classes, and also because of the other thing.
He was kinda fucking his uncle.
The point is that while Quentin may be shady and hiding something, there's no very concrete reason to suspect he's plotting to have Tanya murdered. So why do we so strongly suspect that he is? Well, in the scene where we first meet Quentin, he tells Tanya the legend of the Isola Bella, the remote island just offshore from the hotel.
There's a story attached to that island. There's a house on it that was owned by a wealthy Swedish family, and the old matriarch was the last one living in it, and there were these powerful local investors, if you know what I mean, who wanted the house, wanted the island. They made her all kinds of offers. And then one day her body was found in a heap at the bottom of the rocks.
This tale about covetous crooks killing a rich lady so they can take her shit starts to sound prescient when Jack semi-kidnaps Portia and Tanya finds herself on Quentin's yacht, waiting for a young mafioso to take her to shore. It all seems to add up to something. Or does it? The whole plot to kill Tanya is kind of like one of those illusion sculptures that appear to be a single coherent object from one angle, but then you move and it's actually a whole bunch of separate, disconnected parts. What makes us choose the point of view where everything aligns perfectly rather than one where it doesn't? We're pushed toward one interpretation over another by the underlying meta-narrative, the widow's tragic end on the Isola Bella.
I need 50,000 euros.
50,000 euros. What for?
Albie needs 50,000 euros. Not for him, but for Lucia, the local sex worker who has accrued a massive debt to Alessio, her apparent pimp. Dominic, who had himself employed Lucia earlier in the week before Albie met and fell in love with her, is at first a hard no. Albie can't have the money for Lucia. But then Albie makes him an offer he can't refuse, bundled with a story about Dominic's guilt and redemption.
Give me 50, and I'll help you with Mom.
How are you going to help me?
I don't know. I'll tell her how sorry you are, and how this whole trip, all you could think about was her, and how it seems like you've really changed.
Some have described this deal as kin to blackmail or a bribe, but what really convinces Dominic to give Albie the money is the story about penance and redemption, wherein the money functions as a karmic payment that absolves Dominic of his serial adultery and reconciles him with his estranged wife, Abby.
Think of it as a karmic payment.
Later in the day, Dominic lets Albie know that the money has been transferred and reminds Albie about his end of the deal.
And although it's not why I did it, maybe at some point you can put in a word for me with your mother.
I already did.
When Dominic calls Abby, though, the resolution is fuzzy. She's either busy or doesn't want to talk and ends the call quickly. So again, we have a backgrounded story. This time not a local legend, but the story of redemption that Albie tells Dom, doing a lot of the work to fill in the gaps between what little is known about actual events. We never get to hear the conversation between Albie and Abby, and so we don't have any idea how successful Albie is at convincing her to give Dominic another chance. Furthermore, we know that Abby has always eventually taken Dominic back after all of the other times she's caught him cheating. Why should this time be any different? It's entirely plausible that Abby forgiving Dominic has nothing whatsoever to do with Albie's intercession. Is Abby ready to forgive Dom? And if so, what if any role did Albie play in getting her to that point? The answers to these questions are still entirely unknown by the end of the finale, and yet we the audience seem convinced that we know their answers. Albie called Abby and told her that Dominic is a changed man, and now Abby and Dom are getting back together. We are led to this conclusion not by any actual evidence that the show presents, but rather because we assume that things played out according to the yarn of redemption that Albie spun at breakfast that morning.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight.
It's worth mentioning that this method of filling in knowledge gaps with suggestions provided by a meta-narrative frame is sort of complex. In several examples like the ones I've provided, the audience simply doesn't know what happened or why or how it may have happened, and yet incredibly, the show accomplishes the task of making audiences come away from the show feeling entertained and narratively satisfied. How were the show's creators able to pull it off? The answer is a mystery until you realize that people are actually quite used to hearing stories told in this fashion. The only difference is that White Lotus is honest about being fiction, whereas when we usually encounter stories like it, we're told that it's the truth. The sordid grab bag of right-wing conspiracy theories about the 2020 election, collectively referred to as the Big Lie, is one example. The facts of the Big Lie are, as the name suggests, few, and even the fake facts that proponents cite, Italian satellites, overnight ballot dumps, dead people voting, don't add up to the sprawling fraud that they claim it does. The grifters who push the Big Lie know this, and so instead they emphasize the gaps between the facts, the revelations that haven't yet come to light because they're being suppressed by them. Fox News hate-monger and fourth in line to the frozen lasagna throne, Tucker Carlson is an absolute master of this technique. One of Tuk Tuk's signature moves is to ask a string of questions that go unanswered.
We don't know how many votes were stolen on Tuesday night. We don't know anything about the software that many say was rigged. We don't know. We ought to find out.
The function of this method is to focus the audience's attention not on the facts themselves, because there aren't any facts, but on the mysterious regions between them, the hidden connections that might bring it all together to form one coherent whole. And what we find in this region of the unknown is a meta-narrative invisibly working to manipulate the viewer's thoughts, like George Soros manipulating the global financial markets. But I don't want to just pick on the far right. Liberals are guilty of this kind of thing as well, though to be sure they're far more grounded in reality than shit demons like Tucker Carlson. The January 6th committee, for example, assembled a mountain of facts about the run-up to the riot at the Capitol. But as two researchers who worked for the committee wrote in Just Security, the report's emphasis on Trump meant important context was left on the cutting room floor. That is, the committee's work was driven by a meta-narrative that said that everything led back to Donald Trump. While this may make a good story and even a good legal case, it also effectively exonerates other responsible parties, such as social media executives who allowed conspiracy theory content to proliferate, and far-right hate groups that have existed since before the Trump era and used their own agency to spread their message without Trump's help or influence. Reactionary centrists, who supposedly take a dispassionate, non-ideological, just-the-facts-jack approach to political commentary, are just as driven by meta-narrative as liberals and the far right. In fact, what makes centrists special is that they are either cynical enough or daft enough to proceed as if no meta-narrative is driving their thinking. And there's perhaps no better example of this than the wave of centrist lab leak theory stories that popped up damn near everywhere in late May and early June 2021. Ever since the pandemic hit in early 2020, there were two opposing camps regarding the virus's origins. One camp, which included the overwhelming majority of virologists and medical experts, believed that it is most likely that COVID first entered humans at a so-called wet market in Wuhan, China. This is based on the fact that an animal-to-human jump like this is very common in other coronaviruses, and it is corroborated by the fact that about 2/3 of early cases had visited the Wuhan market. The other camp believed that COVID had originated at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where it was possibly developed as a bioweapon. This theory was based on the fact that there is a thing called the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and also that the Chinese government is run by the Chinese Communist Party and communism, bioweapon, Mao, China, Marxism, China. Well, centrists saw two sides, and in May 2021, based on absolutely no inciting event whatsoever, a host of centrist writers decided that not only was the lab leak a plausible idea, but that it had been unfairly and prematurely dismissed by a group-thinking progressive media. As with the far-right versions of the lab leak theory,
Wuhan's bat lady,
these centrist articles gave nowhere close to sufficient evidence to support their claim that a lab leak was plausible. Instead, what did the driving in these articles was a meta-narrative about woke media elites who shied away from the third rail of the lab leak theory for fear of being labeled racist. So powerful was this narrative that reactionary centrists were unfazed when new scientific evidence emerged that bolstered the market origin hypothesis and rendered the lab leak theory even more dubious than before. This is because, for its proponents, the plausibility of the lab leak theory is grounded not in the strength of the evidence in support of it, but rather in the strength of the narrative about media bias and groupthink. The storytelling in White Lotus is deceptively complex. What at first blush seems to be a rather straightforward, linear narrative turns out to be an illusion and a mystery. You think you know what happened, but when you take a step back, you realize that many things you were certain occurred might not have taken place at all. Instead, what you thought happened was the result of subtle nudges provided by meta-narratives about revenge, betrayal, and redemption that lurk in the background of our main characters' stories. This has parallels to real life, where many stories that purport to be about the real world are held together not by facts, but by meta-narratives about shadowy conspiracies, authoritarian plots, and woke cover-ups. The fact that we've seen so many stories in the media told in this fashion probably plays a role in making White Lotus digestible, and the fact that we get swept up in the smoke and mirrors of White Lotus should cause us to take a step back and evaluate how we consume news media and commentary. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and please take a moment to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment.